In this video, I'd like to discuss a few of the key reasons why I think it is that students stop learning jazz. These really are warning signs in my teaching that I've come across, and hopefully if any of these resonate with you, then I'll discuss some ways that you might overcome them if any of these rings true. So let's get into the list. The first reason why many students stop learning jazz is because it is difficult, especially if you're trying to learn this when you've got a full-time job, a family, things like that. You might not have that much time to dedicate to it. It is not easy to learn. There's things that you've got to learn, like a little bit of theory. You've got to learn to play the instrument. You've got to learn to play songs, transcriptions. So if you need a structured way on how to combat that, then you might want to check out my free beginner jazz guitar course, which is linked and listed below. One thing that I always tell every student that studies with me in their first lesson, be it jazz or general guitar, is that music is challenging. It's not like we just kind of get on the pat on the back. None of us, or at least 95% of us, are not born as natural improvisers. So there are challenges that you have to overcome and you have to stick with it. It's not going to happen overnight. There's a lot of trial and error required, especially with the improvisational kind of side of learning jazz. So once you have that mindset, knowing that you're probably not going to be John Coltrane in 2 weeks, and I think it makes it a lot easier mentally to deal with, and really think about this as being a marathon and not a sprint. The second reason is that the practice is not a high enough priority. Simple as, you either want to do it or you don't. For some people, if they really want to do it, they'll just practice non-stop. But I think what a lot of people really like is the idea of playing music, but not necessarily the idea of practicing music. But you need to practice music in order to be able to play it. So it has to be a high priority in your day-to-day life. It's kind of like brushing your teeth or eating your breakfast. For most people, hopefully, these are just things that you tend to do, and the more that you can kind of get that into a daily routine, then it will become a priority and something that just happens as a matter of course, and hopefully it should have as little conscious effort to do it as possible. If you only practice once every couple of days, once a week, something like that, then it's not a high enough priority. If it's a daily habit, then you're more likely to stick with it in the long term. The third reason why a lot of students stop learning is that the honeymoon period wears off. If you've ever been in a relationship, then you'll know that there's what's known as a honeymoon period, which can be anywhere from 6 months to a year. And I found the same can be true in music as well, oddly enough, either with something like a new guitar or learning a new style. So if you're learning jazz, for example, the first couple of weeks, first couple of months are usually really easy in one aspect because everything's new, it's fresh, it's exciting, you've got a new practice routine, you're learning new things. But once that honeymoon period wears off, then a lot of people tend to go from being very interested to completely disinterested. I've had a few students like that, where they're kind of all in, firing on all 4 cylinders for the first couple of months, and then a couple of months into it they just burn out. So it's very important to kind of keep this as a consistent long-term thing. As I've said in point 1, jazz is not easy, so if you really want to see any serious results, you've got to stick with it and you've got to give yourself the time to learn maybe 10, 20 jazz standards, a couple of transcriptions. You've got to know the key scales, lines, and all that stuff is not going to happen necessarily within the honeymoon period. It might take a year, it might take 2 years. It won't take forever to be able to be jam session ready, but equally, you have to know that it's not all going to happen in the honeymoon period. The fourth reason deals with the 3 elements of practice, which are quite straightforward really. Learn, practice, play. Anything that you ever learn on the instrument comes into those 3 categories. For example, if you were going to learn a new song, then learning the song would involve learning the chords, learning the melody, learning how to improvise over that, lots of learning, lots of intake going on right there. Then the practice is the next part, because once you've learned something, you need to be able to practice it so it becomes second nature to do. And then the third one is probably the most rewarding. That is the playing of it. That means that you can just pick up your guitar and play the tune that you've been working on without it being that much of a conscious effort and that much hard work. Now, what I've found is that these are quite easy to get unbalanced. For example, I've had a couple of students that are always keen to learn new things, like, every time they want to learn something, and that's great. We always want to be learning new things, but what tends to happen if you're always prioritizing learning new things and not practicing or playing older things is that you forget the older things, right? And that's not ideal, because ultimately you want to be able to recall many of the things that you study, like especially tunes, right? If you're just kind of learning one song then forgetting another song, then you're not actually going to build your portfolio of songs, and as a result that could result in you quitting learning jazz because you don't feel like you've got anything substantial. This could also be taken in the reverse, in which a lot of students simply like to pick up and play, but they don't want to learn new things. So you know how it is, where guitar players, we're chronic noodlers. We like to pick up, play and noodle. And whilst that's better than not playing, if you're never learning anything new, you're not actually going to progress. Even though the stuff that you are going to be playing is obviously going to be good, you need to keep adding to your palette of tunes, transcription and technique in order to develop yourself as a musician. And as you can probably guess, the practice element of those three can also be victim to those as well. You can either learn something and then play and not practice. So practice is one that's arguably the most important, because if you've learned something, in order for you to ever be able to play it, you need to practice it so much for it to become an effortless musical output that you need to be able to do it second nature. So that is one that I've found lately, actually, that a lot of students are really neglecting that practice side of it. So if you're learning something like a tune, and I know how it is, right? Sometimes you get really bored of learning it and stuff, and you just don't stick with it enough to kind of glue it to your brain. But you've got to, every time you pick up a guitar, if you've just learned Autumn Leaves or something like that, then you've got to get in the habit of playing it. And ultimately what you'll find, if you keep on doing that for a period of time, there will come a time where you can just pick up your guitar and play any of these standards because you practice them so much. And there's a bunch of tunes that I know like that, ones that I could just be woken up in the middle of the night and play without even thinking about them. So the practice element is very important not to neglect when learning jazz. The last reason why a lot of people get disinterested in learning jazz is not engaging in a community, either local or online. The last reason why a lot of students get disinterested in learning jazz is because they haven't engaged in a community, either online or in person. Now, what I've found as a teacher is that communities really, really help keep you motivated, keep you driven, keep you practicing, keeping you playing. So what are some ways which you can get involved in communities? Well, if you're online and you want to interact with jazz guitar players online, perhaps one of the biggest pitfalls I see, or the biggest shortcomings of jazz, is that as a student, it can kind of feel like you're a student, and then everybody else, especially if you look on social media or you go to a jazz gig, everybody else is a pro, and there doesn't seem to be anything in between. If you go to a jam session, or if you look on Instagram or something like that, all you're going to see is virtuoso musicians. But I guarantee you that's not the case. There are a lot of people who are learners, who are beginner jazz players as well. So for example, in my own teaching, I have something called Jazz Guitar Club, and that is basically Zoom group coaching programs in which I have people from all over the world study together, and I found that to be a very positive experience, and that definitely helps keep people motivated to practice and learning jazz. So that's one thing you might want to do. So if you want to find out more information about my product, then that's linked and listed below, but there are others available as well if they suit your needs. If you're looking to get involved with your in-person jazz community, there's a few different ways that you can go about that. The first one is to seek out a jazz jam session. Quite a lot of cities have these. If you Google them and then your town or your city name afterwards, something might come up which is relevant to you, which you can take your guitar to and go and play and go down that route. However, what I found as a teacher is that is quite intimidating for most guitar students, especially if you're fairly new, maybe you haven't had any lessons or you've only had a couple or something like that, then that prospect is too daunting. So there's a couple of ways you can go about that. The first is that you could go to one jam session and just kind of go and watch and see how things are, write the list of songs down with the intention of playing at the next one. You could perhaps go to a jam session and just comp if you don't want a solo. That might be an easy way into it. Or if both of those seem too overwhelming, then there's a few different options as well. Like you could seek out an in-person jazz teacher, and usually in-person jazz teachers are quite connected with the local scene. So they are often great ways of kind of getting involved with jam sessions, jam buddies, things like that. So those are what I found are the biggest reasons why students quit learning jazz. Which reasons have I missed? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. If you found this video useful and you want more videos like this, please subscribe, and thank you as always to my Patreons who help keep these videos going. Without your help, it wouldn't be possible.